The sun was beginning to sink behind the houses on Maple Street, washing the modest neighborhood of Des Moines in an amber light. Inside one of those houses, Julia Dawson stood at the kitchen counter, her hands deep in soapy water, the faint hum of the dishwasher filling the silence. It had been another long day, laundry, cooking, cleaning, all the small things that made the house function but went unseen. Patricia had come home earlier than usual, slamming the door and muttering under her breath about another argument with her ex-husband. Julia had learned to stay quiet when her daughter was in one of her moods, but that evening the tension didn't fade, it thickened. Patricia's heels clicked sharply across the tile as she grabbed a soda from the fridge. "You didn't pay the gas bill again, did you?" she snapped, not even looking up. Julia turned slowly, drying her hands. "I did, dear. I paid it yesterday morning." "Well, then why did the company call me?" Patricia's voice rose, her eyes narrowing. "I swear, Mom, you can't handle anything anymore. You're so useless sometimes." Julia froze. The word hit her harder than she expected. Useless. She wanted to remind Patricia, who had kept the roof over their heads all these years, who had raised her through nights of fever, heartbreak, and failure. But before she could speak, Patricia stepped closer, her face flushed with anger. "You just sit here, pretending to help, but you make everything worse," she spat. Then literally she spat. The warm drop hit Julia's cheek, shocking her body still. For a moment, neither of them moved. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Andrew appeared in the doorway, clutching his toy car, his wide eyes darting between them. "Mom," he whispered. Patricia turned away, embarrassed now that her son had seen her. "Go to your room, Andrew. This is between adults." The boy hesitated. Julia forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart. Go on." When he disappeared upstairs, Patricia muttered something about stress, about how Julia should stop making her life harder, and stormed out of the kitchen. The front door slammed. Julia stood alone. Her cheeks still burned, not from the spit, but from the realization that her daughter no longer saw her as a mother, but as a burden. She walked slowly to the bathroom sink, turned on the light, and stared at herself in the mirror. The reflection that stared back wasn't the woman she remembered. Her once steady hands trembled slightly. Fine lines carved deep around her mouth. Her eyes, usually kind, looked hollow. She wiped her cheek clean with a trembling hand, the water cold against her skin. For a long time, she simply looked, really looked at herself. Every wrinkle told a story of the factory where she'd sewn dresses for 30 years, of the nights she'd stayed up with Patricia when the girl had nightmares, of the mornings she'd walked to work through snow to save bus fare for her child's future. And now, that same child had looked at her as though she were nothing. Julia turned off the light and walked to her bedroom. The house was quiet except for the faint creak of Andrew's floor above. She sat at the edge of her bed, her palms pressed together, breathing slowly. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She felt something deeper, something that frightened her, a hollow space where her love used to be. She looked around the room. The framed photo of Patricia's college graduation sat on her dresser, dust gathering on the glass. Julia remembered that day. How proud she'd been, how she'd stood in the back row, too shy to join the photo with Patricia's friends. Back then, her daughter had hugged her tightly, whispering, "I'll take care of you one day, Mom." Julia closed her eyes. That promise had turned into this. Outside, the last bit of sunlight faded, leaving the room in gray. She didn't cry. She didn't even sigh. She simply sat there, hands clasped, eyes dry, letting the quiet swallow her. Something inside her was shifting, quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly. It wasn't just the humiliation that broke her. It was the realization that she had allowed it for too long. That in her silence, she had taught Patricia that cruelty had no cost. When she finally lay down, The house felt colder than usual. She listened to the wind brushing against the window pane, the distant sound of a train somewhere beyond the city, and before her eyes closed, a single thought formed, soft but sharp as glass. It wasn't, "Why did she do this to me?" It was, "How did I let her become this way?" That night, Julia Dawson didn't sleep. She simply stared into the darkness, understanding for the first time that something in her had broken beyond repair, and that from that fracture, something else might one day grow. The next morning, the house felt deceptively peaceful. The storm of the night before had left behind a heavy silence, the kind that clung to the walls. Julia stood by the kitchen window, pouring coffee into her chipped porcelain mug, the one she'd had since her first years at the sewing factory. Outside, the maple trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves beginning to turn orange. Autumn was coming. She'd always loved that season, the quiet before the winter, the reminder that even endings could be beautiful. Andrew padded softly into the kitchen, his hair messy, his pajama sleeves too long. "Morning, Grandma," he said, climbing onto a chair. She smiled faintly, her heart softening. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" He nodded, taking a sip of milk. "I had a dream," he said, suddenly eyes bright. "We lived somewhere sunny. There was music all the time and no one yelled." Julia froze for a second. The innocence in his voice sliced through her chest. "That sounds wonderful," she managed to whisper. "Yeah," he said, swinging his feet. "You were smiling. Mom was smiling too. Everyone was happy." Julia's throat tightened. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and forced a smile. Maybe one day, Andrew. Patricia entered the kitchen a few minutes later, her phone in hand. Still in her robe. She didn't greet them. Her eyes were glued to the screen as she complained under her breath. "Unbelievable, late fees again." She sat at the table, typing furiously, muttering about bills, taxes, and how Mom's fixed income doesn't cover half of what this house costs. Julia stirred her coffee, quietly, pretending not to hear. She had learned long ago that saying anything when Patricia was like this only made things worse. "I told Margaret," Patricia said suddenly, her tone sharp, "that I can't keep doing this. The mortgage, the groceries, everything. I'll have to move Mom into a home soon. It's not like she can live on her own." Julia's hand paused mid-stir. The spoon clinked softly against the mug. Patricia didn't notice. She was still scrolling, talking more to herself than to anyone else. This house would sell fast, though. Prices in Beaverdale are crazy right now. I could finally get something decent for Andrew and me. Mom would be better off in assisted living, anyway. Julia turned away from the table, staring out the window again. The yard was quiet except for a few leaves swirling in the wind. For a long moment she didn't breathe. She had worked nearly 40 years for this house, saved every dollar from her sewing job, patching clothes and stitching curtains for neighbors until her fingers ached. When she and her late husband bought it, it had been their dream, a small, sturdy home with enough light for her to sew by the window. Every inch of it held a memory. Andrew's first steps, Patricia's prom photos, her husband's laughter echoing through the hall before he got sick. And now, that same house was being discussed like a business transaction. Julia blinked hard, her vision blurring. She picked up her mug and walked quietly to her bedroom, leaving Patricia still talking. Behind closed doors, she sat on the edge of the bed, the morning light pooling across the quilt she'd made herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed them together. Maybe Patricia was just venting. Maybe she didn't mean it. But Julia had lived long enough to know the difference between frustration and intent. The tone in her daughter's voice wasn't anger, it was calculation. That night, after Andrew had gone to bed and Patricia locked herself in her room with the TV blaring, Julia sat by the kitchen table with the lights dimmed. The silence was louder than ever. She looked at the stack of bills on the counter, the envelopes with her name misspelled by automated printers. She traced a finger along one of them. Her name, Julia Dawson, suddenly felt like someone else's. Her eyes moved toward the hallway, where framed photographs lined the wall. Patricia's childhood smile stared back at her from behind the glass, surrounded by years of sacrifice and love. Julia felt a coldness spread through her chest. For the first time, a thought crept in, uninvited but steady. She's not just angry, she's planning something. Julia turned off the kitchen light, the house slipping into darkness around her. Upstairs, she could hear the faint hum of the TV and Andrew's slow, steady breathing through the vent. As she lay down that night, she stared at the ceiling, unable to close her eyes. The cracks in the plaster looked like veins spreading slowly outward, just like the doubt now running through her heart. And though she didn't know it yet, that single suspicion, the one she tried to silence, was the beginning of everything that would come. Sunday afternoons had always been sacred to Julia Dawson, a day for family, for slow cooking, for warmth filling every room. She'd spent the morning marinating the roast beef, peeling potatoes, and setting the old dining table with the china she'd saved for special occasions. In her mind, she still believed in them, those small moments that might remind Patricia and Margaret what family was supposed to feel like. By the time Margaret arrived, the air was fragrant with garlic and thyme. She greeted Julia with a polite hug, one of those half-hearted gestures that barely touched the skin. "You look tired." "Aunt Julia," Margaret said, glancing around the house. "Still the same curtains?" Julia smiled faintly. "They've served us well. I made them myself years ago." Patricia appeared from upstairs, dressed sharply in a navy sweater, her lipstick too bright for a Sunday at home. "Finally," she said to her sister. "I thought you'd never get here. Come on, let's talk in the kitchen." Julia felt the familiar pang, the subtle dismissal, the way her daughters spoke to each other like she wasn't there. Still, she clung to hope. She carried the roast from the oven, the aroma comforting her more than their presence ever could. "Dinner's almost ready," she called softly. "I'll just set the gravy." Neither of them answered. A few minutes later, Julia wiped her hands on a towel and stepped into the hallway to gather napkins from the cabinet. The voices carried easily through the open kitchen door. She didn't mean to eavesdrop. She simply froze when she heard her own name. "I tried again this week," Patricia was saying, her tone low but sharp. "She still refuses to sign the papers. Says she doesn't need anyone managing her finances. I can't keep waiting. She's going to mess something up, and then we'll all be stuck." Margaret sighed. "You've always let her walk over you, Trish. You think you're the victim, but you're the one who keeps giving her control. If she's too stubborn to sign the power of attorney, then wait until she gets confused enough. Once she starts forgetting things, no one will question it." Julia's breath caught. She pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. "Margaret, that's cruel," Patricia whispered, but there was hesitation, not outrage. I mean, she's not that bad yet." "Yet," Margaret repeated, pouring herself a glass of wine. "You said yourself she's getting slower. She forgets bills, misplaces receipts. It's only a matter of time. The sooner you handle it, the sooner you can sell this place and move on." Julia's eyes stung. Her fingers clutched the napkins, so tightly they tore. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar, like she was standing inside someone else's life. Patricia's voice softened then, almost regretful. "It's not like I hate her, but she's holding me back. Every time I try to move forward, she pulls me down with her routines, her rules. I'm 34, and I still feel like a child living under her roof." Margaret snorted. "Then take the roof." The laughter that followed was quiet but cruel, a sound that twisted Julia's stomach. She stumbled backward into the hallway, gripping the edge of the console table for balance. The framed photo of her late husband, Daniel, nearly fell. She steadied it with shaking hands, her vision swimming. For a moment, She wanted to march into the kitchen and confront them, to shout, to demand respect. But the words wouldn't come. The betrayal was too large, too heavy. Instead, she turned toward the stairs, walking slowly, each step deliberate, as though she might crumble if she moved too fast. In her bedroom, the scent of dinner still lingered faintly from the downstairs vents. She sat at the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, her pulse racing. It wasn't just what she'd heard, it was the tone, the certainty, the casual way her daughters planned her future as if she were already gone. All these years she had believed that love, steady, unconditional love, could heal what was broken between them, that if she kept giving, kept forgiving, something inside Patricia would soften. But tonight, she understood the truth. Her kindness had not inspired gratitude. It had taught her daughter that she could take without consequence. Julia lifted her eyes to the ceiling, blinking away tears that refused to fall. The clock ticked softly on the nightstand. Downstairs, the sound of cutlery clinked faintly. Margaret and Patricia had started eating without her. She knelt beside her bed, her knees aching against the hardwood floor, and whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, not even for peace. God, I've spent my whole life asking for strength to endure. Maybe tonight, give me the strength to change. When she rose, she felt a strange stillness inside her, the kind that comes not from surrender, but from decision. For the first time in years, Julia Dawson no longer felt helpless. She felt awake. The days that followed blurred into quiet motion. Julia kept to her routine, laundry, breakfast, tending to the little garden behind the house, but her mind was no longer at peace. The words she'd overheard that Sunday clung to her like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Every glance from Patricia now carried new meaning. Every word sounded rehearsed. On Wednesday morning, while Patricia was at work and Andrew at school, Julia decided to do something she hadn't done in years. Go through her own papers. She had always trusted Patricia with the household finances. After her husband's death, it had seemed natural to let her daughter handle the online bills and bank notifications. But now, as she opened the old cedar desk in her bedroom, she felt an unfamiliar edge of caution. The drawers creaked open, releasing the faint smell of old paper and cedar oil. Inside were folders neatly labeled in her tidy handwriting. Insurance, utilities, taxes. Beneath them, she found a thinner folder marked Simply Bank. Her heart picked up speed. She carried the folder to her bed and began spreading the statements out one by one. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. But then she noticed a pattern. Withdrawals she didn't remember making. $500 here, $900 there. Each transaction just small enough to escape her attention, but together they added up to several $1,000s. Her hands began to tremble. Julia reached for her glasses and leaned closer. The withdrawals were made using electronic transfers, accounts linked online. She had never used online banking in her life. A cold realization swept through her. Patricia had set those up. For a long moment, Julia sat still, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then she noticed another envelope tucked beneath the stack, half hidden under old receipts. Her name was printed neatly on the front. Power of Attorney, Julia Dawson. She frowned. She had never signed anything like that. Her breath quickened as she unfolded the document. There it was, her name, her address, her date of birth, and at the bottom, her own signature, except it wasn't hers. The letters were shaped wrong, the strokes too heavy, too rushed. She felt her stomach twist. Her daughter had forged her name. Julia dropped the paper onto the bed as if it burned her fingers. She stared at it, the words power of attorney blurring through tears she hadn't felt coming. It wasn't anger that overwhelmed her. It was disbelief, the kind that leaves you hollow. How could Patricia, the child she'd raised through every sickness, every scraped knee, every heartbreak, betray her so completely? She pressed her hands against her chest, trying to calm the racing beat of her heart. For a few minutes, she could only sit there, surrounded by papers that had turned her world upside down. Then she wiped her face, took a deep breath, and stood up. If Patricia had been calculating, then Julia needed to be deliberate. By noon, she had found her old address book, flipping through faded names until one caught her eye, Arthur Reynolds. He had been her late husband's cousin, a retired banker who had helped them buy this house decades ago. Without allowing herself to hesitate, she dialed his number. "Arthur? It's Julia Dawson." Her voice shook despite her effort to sound calm. "I need to ask you about something. Legal." 2 hours later, she sat at his dining table in Ames, papers spread neatly between them. Arthur adjusted his glasses, studying the forged signature with a frown. "This isn't yours," he said plainly. "Whoever did this committed fraud, Julia, if she's been withdrawing money under this authority. That's a serious crime." Julia looked down at her hands. It was Patricia. Arthur's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "You can't ignore this. You need legal protection. Someone who knows elder law." He reached for his phone and handed her a business card. "Martin Sanders. He's one of the best in Des Moines. Trustworthy. Discreet." That afternoon, Julia met with Attorney Sanders at his office downtown. The man was calm, gray-haired. Professional, his voice steady as he explained what had likely happened. "With this document, she could have claimed to act on your behalf," he said gently. "Banks often don't question these unless there's evidence of fraud. The best thing you can do now is protect your assets. We'll revoke this and create a revocable living trust in your name. That means your daughter can't touch a cent without your permission." Julia listened in silence, absorbing every word. Her shock was giving way to something sharper, steadier, a kind of cold focus she hadn't felt in years. She asked questions, took notes, made sure she understood every detail. When the meeting ended, Sanders gave her a reassuring smile. "You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Dawson. It's time to stop reacting and start deciding." Julia nodded slowly. As she walked out of the office into the crisp October air, she felt the wind brush against her face, carrying away the last remnants of denial. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking like a mother trying to fix what was broken. She was thinking like a woman who finally understood that survival sometimes requires silence and strategy. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet resolve would soon become her greatest weapon. By late October, the chill had crept into Des Moines, frosting the edges of the windows each morning. Julia moved through her days quietly, tending to small routines that grounded her, sweeping leaves from the porch, mending Andrew's torn jacket, baking bread that filled the house with a comfort no one seemed to notice anymore. But beneath the calm, a quiet watchfulness had taken root. Every time Patricia spoke, Julia listened differently now, measuring tone, catching shifts, marking patterns. And Patricia had grown bold. One evening, as Julia set down plates of stew on the table, Patricia spoke as if reading from a script. "Mom, we need to talk about your health." Julia looked up. "My health?" "Yes," Patricia said, tapping her fingers against the table, her phone nearby as always. "You've been forgetting things lately. Bills, groceries, even your doctor's appointment last week." "I didn't forget," Julia replied softly. The appointment was rescheduled. Patricia gave a dismissive laugh. "That's what you think. Mom, I'm not trying to be mean, but you're not the same. You repeat yourself. You get confused. It's not safe for you to keep living like this." Julia's spoon paused midair. She studied her daughter's face, the practiced concern, the deliberate softness in her tone. Patricia was trying to sound caring, but her eyes gave her away. They weren't worried. They were calculating. "I think," Patricia continued, "we should look into an assisted living facility. They'd take great care of you. You'd have people around, activities, medication reminders. You wouldn't have to stress about bills anymore. Julia felt her heart tighten, but kept her expression even. That's very thoughtful of you, she said. Patricia blinked, surprised. So you agree? Julia smiled faintly. If it gives you peace of mind, then yes. Let's see what they say. Patricia exhaled, visibly relieved. Good. I'll make an appointment for a cognitive evaluation. Just routine, to confirm everything. Julia nodded, folding her napkin. Whatever you think is best, dear. She rose from the table calmly, though inside, her pulse beat steady and sharp. She had seen her daughter's plan now, a test, a paper trail, a way to prove incompetence. Fine. If Patricia wanted a performance, Julia would give her one. 2 days later, they sat in the waiting room of Dr. Raymond Lee's office. Patricia fidgeted in her chair, scrolling through her phone, while Julia gazed out the window at the bare trees bending in the wind. The office smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. When the nurse called her name, Julia stood, her back straight. Patricia followed close behind, wearing an expression of exaggerated concern. Dr. Lee, a calm man in his 50s, smiled kindly as they entered the small exam room. Mrs. Dawson, good to see you. How are you feeling today? Quite well, doctor, Julia replied. Good. We'll go through a standard memory and cognitive evaluation. Nothing invasive, just some questions. A few recall exercises. He looked over his glasses. Ready? Julia nodded. He began simply. Can you tell me today's date? October 26th, 2023, she said without pause. And the day of the week? Thursday. He smiled. And your address? She recited it perfectly. He moved on, naming the current president, then asking her to list objects in reverse order, to recall a sequence of numbers, to describe the meaning of common proverbs. Each answer came crisp, steady, precise. At one point, Dr. Lee asked, "What was your husband's employer's name?" Julia's eyes softened. Hartman Insurance Group. He worked there 27 years. His employee ID was 2175. Still on the old badge I keep in my desk drawer. The doctor raised his brows, impressed. Patricia's smile faltered. When the exam ended, Dr. Lee closed the file, turned toward Patricia, and said in a clear, professional tone, "Your mother is fully competent, sharp, articulate, oriented to all spheres. I'd say her cognitive health is excellent for her age." Patricia's face flushed. "Are you sure?" "She's been acting." Dr. Lee cut her off gently. "MS. Cool. I understand your concern, but I see no signs of cognitive decline. She's perfectly capable of managing her affairs." Julia reached for her coat, buttoning it calmly. "Thank you, doctor. I appreciate your time." Patricia followed her into the hallway, silent now. Her heels clicked too loudly on the tile floor. Outside, the wind was sharp and cold. As they stepped into the parking lot, Julia glanced at her daughter and said softly, "It's good to know the truth, isn't it?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "You think this is funny?" Julia shook her head. "No, dear. I think it's fair." She walked ahead, her pace slow but steady, leaving Patricia standing by the car. For the first time in years, Julia felt something stir inside her, not anger, not bitterness, but clarity. Patricia had tried to trap her, and instead had exposed herself. As Julia opened the car door, the faintest smile touched her lips. She now knew exactly how far her daughter would go, and exactly what she needed to do next. The week after the doctor's appointment passed with an almost unsettling quiet. Patricia barely spoke to Julia, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She slammed doors louder, sighed theatrically, and left her phone calls on speaker, muttering things like, "I can't deal with this woman anymore." Julia said nothing. She had stopped reacting, stopped feeding the noise. There was something freeing in that silence. Something Patricia couldn't understand. On Monday morning, when Patricia and Andrew left for the day, Julia took her beige wool coat from the hallway hook, tucked a folder under her arm, and stepped outside into the crisp air. The sky over Des Moines was pale gray, the kind of sky that promised winter was close. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, clutching her purse, a small, deliberate figure moving through the quiet streets, no longer fragile but focused. By noon, she was once again seated across from Martin Sanders, the attorney. His office was lined with dark wood shelves and framed degrees, the faint scent of paper and ink grounding the room. He smiled warmly when she entered. "Mrs. Dawson, I was hoping you'd come back." Julia placed the folder on his desk. "I'm ready to finish what we started." He nodded, opening the file and scanning through the documents they'd begun the previous week. "Your revocable living trust is nearly complete. Once you sign, everything in your name, property, savings, pension, will transfer under this trust. You'll remain the sole trustee while you're alive. It ensures your daughter can't access any of it, no matter what she claims." Julia listened closely, her eyes steady. "And the bank accounts?" "I recommend closing the joint account immediately," he said. "We'll move the remaining balance into the trust's account under your control. I'll have our paralegal set up the transfers today. You'll need to update all direct deposits and automatic payments yourself, but it's simple enough." She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of decades begin to loosen. "Good. I don't want her finding any open door." Sanders smiled. "You're being wise. Quiet moves are the safest ones." That afternoon, Julia visited the bank downtown. The teller, recognizing her from years of deposits, greeted her kindly. "Closing the joint account, Mrs. Dawson?" "Yes," Julia said, signing the papers with steady hands. "It's time." When the final stamp hit the page, she felt something inside her settle. She spent the next few days moving through her home like a ghost in reverse, untethering instead of haunting. She gathered personal documents, changed passwords, stored sentimental items in a small cedar box, and packed her husband's old watch and Andrew's baby photos carefully into her suitcase. Arthur Reynolds stopped by once in the evening, bringing her contact information for a realtor he trusted. "Name's Helen Marshall," he said. "Quiet, professional, and knows how to handle private listings. She won't ask questions." Julia thanked him, her voice calm. "Tell her I'm selling, but not to put up any signs." Arthur hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure about this, Julia?" She met his gaze with a small, peaceful smile. "I've been sure about very few things in my life, Arthur. But this I know." By Friday, she had met with Helen at a cafe near Beaverdale Park. They talked softly over tea, discussing the property's value and timeline. Julia signed the preliminary paperwork under the trust's name, her handwriting graceful, unwavering. When she returned home that evening, Patricia was still at work. The sun was setting, spilling amber light through the kitchen window. The house looked softer in that glow, almost forgiving. Julia brewed a pot of chamomile tea and sat at the dining table where so many arguments had taken place. She took out a stack of stationery paper and began to write. The first letter was for Patricia. It wasn't cruel or angry, only honest. She wrote of love and disappointment, of the years spent giving without being seen. She ended it with one quiet line. "You taught me that silence isn't peace. It's only waiting." The second letter was for Andrew, sealed with a small drawing of a son she used to sketch for him as a child. It told him he was her joy, her reason to keep believing in kindness. "Be better than what you see," she wrote. "Grow into the light, even if others choose the shadow." The third letter was for herself, a confession more than a message. She wrote about fear, about motherhood, about the years of shrinking herself to keep the peace. And then, one line that steadied her hand as she wrote it, "I forgive the woman who stayed too long." When all 3 envelopes were sealed and stacked neatly on the table, Julia sat back and looked around. The clock ticked softly, and outside, the wind whispered against the siding of the old house. She thought about how much of her life had been spent fixing, mending, repairing, clothes, people, relationships. But tonight, she wasn't patching anything. She was building something new, quietly, deliberately. As she signed the final trust document that evening and slipped it into her purse, a sense of stillness washed over her. Not sadness, not regret, just peace. For the first time in decades, Julia Dawson felt free. The morning Julia Dawson left her home, the world was still asleep. A pale silver dawn stretched across the horizon, the kind of fragile light that makes even familiar places look strange. The house was silent, no footsteps, no voices, no clattering dishes in the kitchen, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. She rose quietly, her movements deliberate. Her suitcase sat by the bed, small and worn, packed neatly with only what mattered. A few clothes, her sewing scissors, the letters she'd already sealed, and the watch her husband had once worn every Sunday. She had thought about taking more. Old photos, her wedding ring, but this wasn't a retreat. It was a beginning, and beginnings didn't need weight. Julia stood for a moment at the edge of her bed, the early light brushing across her lined face. For years, she had woken to the sound of other people's needs, Patricia's demands, Andrew's cries, the echo of her late husband's voice in memory. But today, there was no sound calling her back. She walked to the window and looked out. The maple tree in the yard was shedding the last of its leaves, scattering amber and red across the cold ground. That tree had been planted when Patricia was born, its roots deep, its branches strong. Now it looked bare, but not dead, just waiting for spring. Downstairs, she moved quietly, each creak of the floorboard reminding her how long she had lived within those walls. In the kitchen, the smell of last night's tea still lingered faintly. On the dining table, she placed 3 sealed envelopes and a folder, the trust papers, signed and notarized, the documents that would rewrite the future her daughter thought she could control. She touched each letter once, gently as if blessing them. Then she looked around one last time, the curtain she had sewn by hand, the worn armchair by the window, the faint dent on the wall where Andrew once tossed a baseball too hard. Everything she loved had roots here, but none of it belonged to her anymore. She walked to the doorway, her coat already buttoned, her hands gloved. For a moment, she hesitated, turning back to the house that had once been her whole world. Her voice came out in a whisper, steady and sure. "She took my respect," she murmured. "Now I'm taking back my life." The taxi's headlights flickered through the window, slicing through the gray light of dawn. Julia opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled clean, sharp, new. Her breath clouded in front of her as she walked down the short path, her suitcase wheels crunching softly on the gravel. The driver, a young man with kind eyes, loaded her bag without a word. She gave him the address, Ames, Iowa, and slid into the back seat. The leather was cool against her palms. As the car pulled away, Julia looked through the window. The house grew smaller, the windows dim and unseeing. For a heartbeat, she imagined Patricia waking, finding the letters, realizing too late what her mother had done. But Julia didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in her heart, only clarity. She turned her gaze toward the road ahead, the fields stretching endlessly under the early sun. The city slowly faded behind her, replaced by open land and wide skies. For the first time in decades, she wasn't running from anything. She was moving toward something. By the time they reached Ames, the sun had fully risen, spilling gold across the frost-covered fields. Arthur Reynolds was already waiting outside his modest brick house, hands tucked into his coat pockets, a gentle smile spreading as he saw the taxi approach. When Julia stepped out, he reached for her suitcase immediately. You did it, he said quietly. I did, she replied. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from release. Arthur nodded toward the doorway. Come inside. There's coffee and a fresh start waiting. Julia took one last look at the horizon before following him in. The morning light caught the edge of her silver hair, making it shimmer like the first trace of dawn. Inside the warmth of Arthur's kitchen, she sat down and exhaled deeply, fully, as if years of silence were leaving her body all at once. For the first time in her life, Julia Dawson wasn't someone's mother, wife, or burden. She was simply herself, and that at long last was enough. The house felt colder that morning. When Patricia stumbled out of bed, her head pounding from a restless night, the first thing she noticed was the silence. No clinking dishes from the kitchen, no smell of coffee brewing, no faint humming from her mother's room, just the hollow stillness of absence. She frowned, glancing at the clock. 6:47 a.m., Mom, she called, her voice rough. No answer. She knocked on Julia's door, pushed it open, and froze. The bed was neatly made, the nightstand clear, the closet half empty. The old cedar jewelry box was gone. Mom, she said again, louder this time. The words echoed off the walls. A strange unease prickled under her skin. She rushed down the stairs, scanning the living room. Everything looked the same, except for the dining table. 3 envelopes set neatly beside a manila folder. She recognized her name on the top letter. Her stomach twisted as she tore it open. Patricia, it began, written in Julia's soft, familiar cursive. I loved you more than my own breath. But love without respect becomes servitude. I cannot give you what you have already taken. I hope one day, when the noise fades, you will understand that silence was not weakness. It was my last act of love. Patricia's throat tightened. She tossed the letter aside and grabbed the folder, flipping it open. Legal documents, deeds, signatures, bank transfers. Her eyes darted across the pages until one line stopped her cold. Property transfer. Julia Dawson, Revocable Living Trust. Authorized by Trustee Julia Dawson. Executed under legal counsel, witnessed and notarized. No, she whispered, scanning again. No, no, no. The trust was official. Irreversible, airtight. The house, the one she had planned to sell, the asset she'd thought of as hers, was no longer under her control. Julia had sold it quietly, legally, completely. Patricia's panic rose like fire in her chest. She grabbed her phone and dialed Margaret. She's gone, she hissed. Mom's gone. She sold the house. Everything's in her name again. Margaret's voice came through, groggy but alarmed. Calm down. She can't do that without you knowing. She did. There are papers, legal papers. She must have had a lawyer. Then, contest it, Margaret snapped. Find your own attorney. She's probably confused or manipulated. Confused. The word echoed bitterly in Patricia's head. Within an hour, she was sitting in an office downtown, across from a young attorney who flipped through the documents with a neutral expression. Everything here looks legitimate, he said finally. Your mother had full mental capacity when she signed these. It's all notarized and filed correctly. Patricia slammed her hand on the desk. She's 70 years old. She doesn't even know how to use online banking. Someone must have tricked her. The attorney raised an eyebrow. Do you have evidence of that? She hesitated. No. But he leaned back, his tone cooling. Be careful what you accuse, Miss Cole. If your mother's lawyer produces proof of competency, and you've been accessing her accounts or documents without permission, that could fall under elder financial abuse. It's a serious charge. Patricia's mouth went dry. What did you say? The attorney didn't answer. He simply handed her a business card. You'll want to contact Martin Sanders, the opposing counsel. He's already filed notice of the trust's establishment. Patricia left the office shaking, rage and fear twisting inside her. She drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. By noon, her phone buzzed with a new email. Subject: Notice of cease and desist unauthorized financial access. The sender: Martin Sanders, attorney at law. The message was brief and devastating. Ms. Cole, this correspondence serves as formal notification that all accounts and property formerly associated with Julia Dawson are now under the protection of her living trust. Attached are certified documents verifying her mental competence as assessed by Dr. Raymond Lee. Please note, any further attempt to access or challenge her estate without grounds will be considered harassment and potential fraud, given your prior forged power of attorney. Patricia's hands shook as she scrolled. Attached was a scanned copy of the evaluation form, Dr. Lee's signature clear and bold at the bottom. Fully competent. The forged power of attorney, now filed as evidence, was listed under potential criminal review. For a long moment, Patricia just stared at the screen. The house felt smaller, darker. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she sank into a chair. The letter from her mother lying open on the floor. The words blurred before her eyes. She had played a game of control and lost to the quiet woman she'd always underestimated. 2 days later, in a cozy house in Ames, Julia sat at Arthur Reynolds's kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea. The phone on the counter buzzed. It was Martin Sanders. She answered calmly. Yes, Mr. Sanders. His voice was steady, a hint of satisfaction beneath his professionalism. Just wanted to let you know everything's finalized. The trust is fully secured. The sale has cleared and your daughter has been notified. Legally, she can't touch you or your assets now. Julia closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Thank you, she said. There was a brief pause, and then she heard herself laugh. Softly at first, then fuller, deeper, freer than she had ever allowed herself before. Not from cruelty, not from victory, from relief, from justice. Arthur, hearing the sound from across the room, smiled. Good news, he asked. Julia nodded, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Good news. Outside, the late autumn wind rustled through the trees, scattering golden leaves across the yard. Julia stood by the window, watching them fall, one after another, each a small, quiet act of letting go. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for permission to breathe. She simply did. 2 months later, winter sunlight spilled softly over Madison, Wisconsin, the kind of golden light that made everything look clean again, as though the world itself were starting over. Julia Dawson stood in front of a boutique on Monroe Street, her gloved hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed into the cold air. Above the door, a simple wooden sign read, Grace and Thread. The shop had once been nothing more than her friend Martha Jenkins's modest dream. But now the two women ran it together, a haven for women who, like them, had weathered storms and come out quieter, wiser, stronger. Inside, bolts of fabric in muted shades of cream, rose, and charcoal lined the walls, and the faint hum of a sewing machine blended with the music that played softly through the speakers. Morning, Julia, Martha called from behind the counter, adjusting a display of scarves. She was a few years younger, her auburn hair streaked with silver. You ready for the rush today? The local paper's feature came out this morning. We're officially the talk of Madison's winter fashion scene. Julia smiled, setting down her cup. Rush or not, I'll take steady work over chaos any day. She hung her coat on the rack and walked to the sewing table near the window. Her designs, clean, timeless pieces for older women, had started as sketches she never meant to show anyone. But Martha had seen the drawings one afternoon and insisted they bring them to life. You have a gift, Julia, she'd said, and not just for fabric, for telling stories through what people wear. And it turned out to be true. Each design she made carried a name and a story: the resilient shawl, the second chance blouse, the quiet strength wrap. The customers who came through the door weren't just shopping. They were reclaiming something. Dignity, memory, hope. By noon, the shop buzzed softly with voices and laughter. Julia moved gracefully among the customers, helping women try on coats and dresses, offering gentle advice. Her once nervous hands were sure now, each stitch purposeful. When she smiled, it reached her eyes. At one point, the bell over the door chimed again. A frail woman in her 70s stepped in, clutching her purse as if it were armor. Her hair was thin, her eyes rimmed red. "Welcome," Julia said warmly. "It's cold out there. Come in. Have some tea." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Julia led her to a chair near the counter. "Take your time. We're in no rush here." After a moment, the woman sighed. "I'm sorry. I'm not really here to shop. I just needed to be somewhere that doesn't feel like a hospital." Julia tilted her head gently. "You're not from around here?" "No," the woman whispered. "My daughter's moving me into assisted living next week. Says I can't handle things anymore." Her voice trembled. "But I can. I still cook, I pay my own bills. She just doesn't want me around." The words landed like echoes from another life. Julia crouched beside her, resting a comforting hand over the woman's. "You still have choices," she said softly. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The woman looked up, her eyes brimming. "You really think so?" Julia nodded. "I know so." For a long moment, they stayed like that, two women connected by the invisible thread of understanding. Then the woman smiled faintly, and Julia helped her pick out a soft lavender shawl, insisting it was a color that forgives the years. When she left, she looked lighter somehow, as if she'd reclaimed something small but precious. Martha came over, watching her go. "You always know what to say," she said quietly. Julia smiled, looking down at the spool of thread between her fingers. "Only because I've been where she is." Later that evening, after the last customer left, Julia locked the door and turned off the lights. The shop glowed in the golden haze of the street lamps, reflecting softly in the window pane. She stood there for a moment, seeing her own reflection, older, yes, but no longer small. She had once believed that life ended the moment someone took your freedom, but now she understood that's when it truly begins. As she stepped outside, snow began to fall, gentle, deliberate flakes that caught in her hair. She tilted her head toward the sky, breathing in the crisp air the faint scent of pine and city lights. Madison felt alive, like possibility itself. And Julia Dawson, once silenced, once broken, walked down the street with her chin lifted and her heart open. For the first time, she wasn't surviving. She was living. A full year had passed since Julia Dawson left Des Moines behind. Winter had come and gone. Spring had brought its green forgiveness. And now summer bathed Madison in golden warmth. Julia's days were full. Work at Grace and Thread had flourished beyond anything she and Martha could have imagined. The boutique had become more than a business. It was a community of women who'd survived storms and learned to rebuild from the ruins. Julia's designs now hung in local galleries, her story quietly inspiring others who had once been silenced. But one warm afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the shop window, her phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. She almost didn't answer, but something in her chest urged her to. "Mrs. Dawson," a calm male voice said. "This is Mr. Evans, principal at Lincoln Middle School in Des Moines. I hope I'm not intruding." Julia's heart tightened. "No, not at all. Is something wrong?" "It's about your grandson, Andrew. He's been struggling, withdrawn, distracted, occasionally upset in class. When we spoke with his mother, she mentioned you haven't been in contact. I thought perhaps, if you were willing, you might reach out." For a long moment, Julia said nothing. Then, quietly, she replied, "Yes, I'll come." The next morning, The bus rolled into Des Moines under a hazy sky. Julia hadn't been back since the day she left. The city felt the same and yet utterly foreign, like revisiting a place from a dream that no longer belonged to her. She carried a small handbag and the same calm that had carried her through everything. Mr. Evans greeted her at the school office. "He's in the library," he said gently. "You can go right in." Julia walked through the familiar corridors, her footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors. And then there he was sitting at a table, his shoulders slumped, a pencil unmoving in his hand. "Andrew," she said softly. He turned. For a heartbeat he didn't move. Then his eyes widened, filling with tears, and he ran to her. Julia dropped to her knees as he threw his arms around her neck, clinging tightly, trembling. "Grandma," he sobbed, "Mom said you hate us, that you left because of me." Julia's breath caught. She cupped his face in her hands, her eyes glistening. "Oh, sweetheart, no, I could never hate you." "Then why did you go?" he whispered. She brushed away a tear on his cheek, her voice gentle but firm. "Because I stopped letting people hurt me. That's all. Sometimes walking away isn't leaving, it's surviving." He buried his face against her shoulder, crying quietly. She held him for a long time, rocking him the way she had when he was little, around them. The world fell silent, just the soft hum of air conditioning, the faint flutter of pages turning somewhere nearby. When Andrew finally calmed, she smiled. "You're growing up strong, just like I knew you would. Don't let anyone tell you that kindness makes you weak, all right?" He nodded, still holding her hand. A quiet voice broke the moment. "Mom." Julia turned. Patricia stood by the doorway, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. She looked smaller somehow, as if life had finally stripped away all her defenses. "I didn't know you'd come," Patricia said shakily. Julia rose slowly, her posture graceful but steady. "The school called. They said Andrew needed me." Patricia nodded, twisting her hands. I didn't know what to say to him. I told him you were angry, but you weren't. Were you?" Julia studied her daughter's face, seeing not the cruel, calculating woman from a year ago, but a broken one, someone finally standing in the ruins she had built. "No, Patricia," Julia said softly. "I wasn't angry. Just done." Tears streamed down Patricia's cheeks. "Please come home. We can fix this. I can change." Julia's voice was kind but unyielding. "You asked me to leave, remember?" Patricia flinched, as if the words themselves carried weight. Julia reached out and gently touched her daughter's shoulder, not in reconciliation but in release. "Take care of him," she said quietly, "and of yourself." Then she turned and walked away, Andrew's small wave catching her at the door. She smiled back, proud, sad. Free. That evening, Julia sat on a bench by Lake Mendota, the sun sinking into a watercolor sky of orange and violet. The surface of the water shimmered like silk, rippling softly in the breeze. Across the horizon, the first lights of Madison flickered awake. She closed her eyes and let the moment settle in, the sounds of the lake, the distant laughter from a passing couple, the weightless peace in her chest. Her thoughts drifted to the past year, the pain, the silence, the courage it took to reclaim her own name. And then, quietly, she spoke, not to anyone, but to the wind itself. "They called me stubborn, crazy, old," she murmured, her voice soft but sure. "But dignity isn't stubbornness. It's knowing when to stand alone." As the last light faded across the lake, Julia Dawson smiled, not the smile of a woman who had won, but of one who had finally learned how to live unbroken.